I'm going to talk mostly about Canadian foreign policy, not the situation in Palestine, and the forces affecting Canadian foreign policy. However, the situation in Palestine right now is extremely serious and does need to inform our approach to these topics. For all the hype about the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, we saw that the withdrawal merely ushered in increased aerial bombardment and artillery attacks on the people of Gaza. Gaza remains occupied, its borders and airspace controlled by the Israeli military, its population subject to continuous airstrikes, artillery fire, and ground incursions from the Israeli occupation forces. Meanwhile, the settlers who were evacuated from the Gaza Strip to make the way for more indiscriminate Israeli bombardment of the territory have been redeployed to the West Bank, where occupation and settlement continue, and where the Palestinian population is being ghettoized into increasingly isolated cantons by the continued construction of the apartheid wall. To this has been added an international embargo, the first of its kind in history, where a people still under occupation are themselves being subject to an international sanctions regime that's effectively subjecting them to increased deprivation and widespread chronic malnourishment. That's the situation in the West Bank and Gaza. Within pre-1967 Israel, we see Palestinian citizens relegated to second-class citizenship. And perhaps most fundamentally of all, the millions of Palestinian refugees displaced from their homeland since 1948 remain barred from returning to their homes in flagrant Israeli violation of international law. Again, I don't want to focus on this situation too much, but rather on Canadian policy. But I think it is important for us to look to the growing chorus of international condemnation of this system and to take very seriously the analysis coming from the Palestinian national movement, from Israeli dissidents, from the South African anti-apartheid movement, and begin describing Israel not just as an occupying power, not just as a colonial state, but indeed as an apartheid state with a system of ethnic, national, and religious discrimination firmly entrenched in law. Now, where does Canada fit into this? Well, the Canadian establishment is a very proud ally and supporter of this Israeli system. We just recently saw our Foreign Minister, Peter MacKay, visit Israel-Palestine and use that opportunity to brag that his government, the Canadian government, was the first country in the world to join Israel in sanctioning the Palestinian Authority and opening this embargo. That happened in March 2006 and was by no means an isolated incident. Over the summer, as Israeli military attacks expanded from the occupied territories and from the occupied West Bank and Gaza, and as the Israeli massacre of people in Gaza then expanded into Lebanon in July, and Israeli forces began to destroy the civilian infrastructure in Lebanon and attack civilian population centers there, our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, described Israeli military operations as a measured exercise of Israel's right to defend itself. He was praised by Gerry Schwartz, the head of the Canadian Onyx Corporation, for playing a leadership role in pushing forward pro-Israel diplomacy internationally against the Palestinian and Lebanese people. So Gerry Schwartz, the head of Onyx Corporation that issued the support for Harper over the summer, did so in the form of a press release, released through an organization called CIJA, CIJA, the Canadian Council for Israel and Jewish Advocacy. CIJA organizes these parliamentary dinners from time to time, and a couple years ago, in November 2004 now, it was Prime Minister Paul Martin addressing the CIJA gathering. CIJA will return to this institution later. At the time, Martin declared that Canada will not, nor will we ever, waver in our support for Israel. Eager to step it up above the Harper government's complicity with Israeli apartheid, a week ago yesterday that is, Prime Minister Harper addressed this same gathering and said that Israel will always have a steadfast friend in the new government of Canada. Now, this is an extreme support for Israeli crimes coming from the Canadian establishment, and it is, moreover, a cross-partisan support. We had the support from the Paul Martin Liberals, we see the support from the Stephen Harper Conservatives, and the CIJA gathering that I described a week ago yesterday also had the supportive attendance of Liberal leader Stéphane Dion, NDP leader Jack Layton, and others. This is being met with appreciation from certain quarters. So, for example, during McKay's visit at the end of last month to Israel-Palestine, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's office expressed deep appreciation for the Canadian administration's support. During that same visit, the Israeli Foreign Ministry added that Canadian bilateral and diplomatic ties with Israel are currently at their peak. So there's appreciation from Israel. There's appreciation from a good deal of corporate Canada for this shift. No doubt, the United States is also grateful that Canada is joining it and a cluster of its allies in isolation and in support of Israel against the bulk of the international community. For us, however, this raises very important concerns. And I think we really need to start thinking about how we can address this terrible, deteriorating diplomacy on the part of the Canadian government. The starting point for developing a strategic challenge to this policy is discussions such as these of what forces are shaping this policy. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. Now, we really shouldn't be looking at Canadian Israel-Palestine policy in isolation. This escalating Canadian support for Israel's system of ethnic, national, and religious discrimination, this escalating Canadian support for Israeli violence and war crimes, corresponds with a broader shift in Canadian foreign policy that we're really seeing across the board. What we're seeing is the abandonment of this pretense that the Canadian establishment used to be so fond of concern for democracy and human rights. The Canadian government used to be really eager to wrap up its military operations as peacekeeping. Now we hear from Canadian Chief of Defence Staff General Rick Hillier that we're not peacekeepers. The Canadian Army's job is to be able to kill people, and we're trying to do so in Afghanistan against the detestable murderers and scumbags arrayed against the NATO occupation. Similarly, in Palestine, we're seeing an abandonment of this pretense that Canada serves as a neutral player in the conflict, as even-handed, as an honest broker. Rather, we are a full-fledged ally of Israel in its war against the native population of the territory. Now, the hypocrisy of Canadian elites on the question of foreign policy was always really off-putting. But what we're not seeing is an abandonment of that hypocrisy in favor of an honest reevaluation of the racism of Canadian policy, of its alignment with the United States, of the human rights violations that it supports. Rather, what we're seeing is the abandonment of this pretense of concern for democracy and human rights that's to give way to a more vicious policy, a more militarist policy, and a policy more openly allied with the U.S. empire. So, dominant Canadian social institutions, pretty much across the board, appear to support this shift. In Toronto, the CIJA, alongside another Israel lobby group in Toronto, organized a corporate gala, which was heralded by the National Post as the business event of last winter season. Similarly, the press is lining up behind this. So, for example, during the invasion of Lebanon in late July of last summer, the Globe and Mail sort of nicely conveyed the flavor of press coverage of the conflict with an editorial, the title of which was, "Harper is right on the Mideast." And that's pretty much been the line we're hearing. The population of Canada, however, is not yet behind this foreign policy. Successive polls reveal, on the one hand, we've got Palestine Solidarity organizing, healthy moves towards a movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, and so forth. Now, that doesn't exactly represent mass participation on the part of Canadian society. And really what we see, though, is the government's policy doesn't either.